my kingdom for just one more moment. Edward, be strong.
Hey guys, tonight we step into the cold, torchlit corridors of Whitehall Palace, where a whisper snakes through the frost. The king is rotting alive on the damp stone floor. The stench of decay suffocates the air. Henry VIII's ulcers seep blood and pus, soaking into the bed linens, forcing even the most loyal attendants to hide behind scented cloths lest they collapse. You would not survive a moment standing still outside that chamber. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what the local time is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the winter of 1547, as the wind howled through the crevices of Whitehall Palace, each gust carried an icy breath, and the rumour that the king is rotting alive echoed once more through the damp halls. Like a languid note, it reverberated in everyone's mind, from courtiers to guards, reminding them that authority and glory are but fragile shells before the decay of the flesh. Behind the heavy door where Henry VIII, once the Lion of England, was enduring his final, haunting days, time itself seemed to halt, his body swollen and festering, each ragged breath stirring the candle smoke into uneasy eddies. Within the velvet-draped, gilded chamber, the stench of rot assaulted every sense. From the king's ulcered legs oozed a thick discharge, a blend of blood, pus, and rotting flesh that seeped into the bedding, the sores growing ever wider and deeper. Outside the door, the royal physicians were at a loss. All they could do was replace the bandages continuously, mop the floor, and pray the king would not scream in the night, for such screams were more terrifying than the room's deathly silence. The curtains rustled in each gust, a reminder that however bitter the January cold, the air inside remained suffocating. In that sick room, no weakness was permitted. One careless movement could burst a sore, releasing the pungent perfume of death. The loyal courtiers, though trembling so violently their heads spun, still stood dutifully behind handkerchiefs soaked in licorice, rosemary, and vinegar to stifle the stench. Yet even with noses covered, they could not prevent themselves from retching in the corridor, a stark sign that the odour had become the room's sole ruler. Some described it as the smell of fermenting flesh. Others likened it to the breath of death itself. Oh, despite the biting chill of January freezing everything it touched, the door remained wide open. It was believed that fresh air from outside might dilute the stench. But in truth, the cold seeped in and mingled with the warmth of decay, creating an uncanny ambience, winter's breath and death's breath intertwined in a grim symphony. Anyone who dared enter that chamber left pale and shaking within minutes, their stomachs churning. One courtier only managed to stand beside the king's bed for a few heartbeats before bolting into the corridor, vomiting uncontrollably without even covering his face. Yet in that harsh feudal order, no one dared complain, for to serve the king, even as he melted into his mattress, remained the highest honour. Beneath the facade of blazing splendour, the blind power had reduced Henry VIII to a tragic embodiment of decaying flesh, a disgrace not only to himself, but to the entire Tudor dynasty. And in that dreadful setting, every breath he drew was a plea for life, and every gust of frigid air marked the approach of death's inexorable steps. To broaden the portrait of his life, let us now turn back the clock by several decades, to the time when Henry I was a bright-eyed boy raised amid silk and power, gradually maturing into the consummate embodiment of the Renaissance by the age of 17. From the moment of his birth, Henry was born into glory. He was the first son of William of York and Isabella of Lancaster, the two most powerful houses in England at that time. His parents attended to every detail of his nourishment and rest. In the morning he was awakened by gentle music. At luncheon he enjoyed rabbit stew with fresh herbs. And at night he drank walnut milk, sweetened with honey, to ensure a deep slumber. At the age of 6, Henry began his lessons in courtly etiquette, learning to bow when greeting dignitaries, to sit upright in his high-backed chair, and to wield knife and fork skills every young prince or noble child had to master. Alongside these royal routines, he was taught Latin, Roman history, and Christian theology by renowned tutors. Each day, Henry sat at an intricately carved wooden desk to practice calligraphy on parchment alongside his peers. His father stressed the importance of discipline and honor. Power must be matched by responsibility. The king's father would say. His mother counseled him in courtesy and compassion. A good king places the welfare of his people above all else. At the age of 10, Henry began training in horsemanship and archery in the royal hunting grounds. His first wooden sword was presented to him during his knighting ceremony, accompanied by the reminder that one day he would bear a true sword to defend the throne. A passion for the hunt blossomed from that point. The thunder of hooves over dry leaves and the crack of the bowstring all nurtured a spirit of strength and bravery in the young prince. By the age of 17, Henry was the perfect image of the Renaissance. Muscular, handsome, skilled with the rapier, an avid hunter, and a face that shone like the sun. He stood tall, broad-shouldered, with a straight back that captured every gaze. Each step he took across the great hall echoed with majesty, drawing the admiration of every courtier. At courtly dances, he moved with grace, displaying youthful vigor and confidence. In mock battles, his gleaming sword struck fear into the hearts of would-be rebels. His presence bathed the court in a halo of brilliance, delighting loyal subjects and subduing enemies alike. Yet, barely a few decades later, that very body had darkened beyond recognition. By the year 1547, Henry weighed over 180 kilograms. His chest heaved with every laboured breath, and the once muscular legs had become swollen masses of agony. The confident stride of youth had turned into a burden that crushed his own being. The royal physicians described each step he forced himself to take as a fresh jolt of gut-wrenching pain, causing all who witnessed it to shudder. The horrifying ulcers, likely infected with gangrene, refused to heal. They gnawed from thigh to ankle, tearing the flesh open and oozing thick. Dark pus intermixed with congealed blood. Every bandage removed was soaked through and weighed heavily, filling the air with a pungent stench that seemed to encapsulate all of the king's sins. He could not mount the stair to the council chamber. He could barely stand, and even to sit required the operation of a crude pulley contraption installed in his private quarters. The courtiers had to deftly maneuver each oversized segment of his body onto chairs or his bed in order to avoid tearing the fragile skin. His abdomen had become so distended that he was unable to bend forward, forced to lie, propped against dozens of pillows throughout the day. The rise and fall of that bloated midsection resembled a drum being slowly pumped and released, evoking the sensation that it might burst at any moment. Each spasm grew more violent, as though his entrails were straining to escape. His eyes, once bright with promise, had turned bloodshot, the yellowed hue of jaundice, lending them a sunken despair. They sometimes glazed over, sometimes fluttered open, then snapped, shut only to jerk open again, as if he were being hauled back from another realm. His brows furrowed in agony. His gaze, when it focused, seemed to track an unseen horror. He would part his lips and inhale a breath of death's essence, a sickly sweet aroma like rotting fruit laced with bitter bile. In those days, it was called the breath of the grave. By modern medicine, it would signify liver failure, diabetes, severe septicemia, and quite possibly cirrhosis of the liver. Despite his body's surrender, the king's power persisted in ceremony. courtiers still knelt in obeisance each time he uttered a command. The Lord Chancellor whispered matters of state at his bedside, sharing secret glances, and the royal scribe continued to affix the seal Henry Rex to documents, as though that iron grip remained strong enough to hold the realm together. The illusion of control endured even as his physical vessel sank beneath the waves. Power had laid such an elaborate carpet that the knocking of death at the door went unheard. In that suffocating chamber, the sunlit sovereign of former days now paled beneath the sputtering candlelight, his body draped in a sheen of yellowish fluid that trickled across the mattress. Each hoarse cough became a final testament to power's fragility, and every feeble heartbeat rang as a death knell for a dynasty on the brink. And so, beneath unyielding protocol, Henry I remained the majestic king in name, even as his flesh yielded to the inexorable decay of mortality. Beneath his yellowed skin, every organ was exhausted, his abdomen bloated violently, signaling an accumulation of fluid and gas. His deep-set yellow eyes betrayed severe liver failure. His laboured breaths and the strange decay, like stench, suggested advanced liver dysfunction, type 2 diabetes, and severe septicemia. The gout, the king's disease, tore at his joints, while osteoporosis rendered his bones brittle. Years of rich wine, sugar, and fatty meats had drained his health into his stomach, turning every meal into an implacable enemy. Yet the king remained keenly aware of his wretched state. On the rare occasions when he regained lucidity, he wept in solitude, hiding his tears from attendants. For his grief was more than physical agony. It was a profound shame. This was the monarch who once executed with an iron rod, shattered friendships, and founded a new church to defy the Pope. Now he could not even cleanse himself after each privy visit. The image of the proud warrior of old had vanished into a distant memory, replaced by a gaunt, frail figure consumed by self-reproach. His every day had become a ritual of decay. Attendants carried bowls of scented water and gently dabbed at his ulcers, only to spread the infection further. They murmured prayers with trembling hands, their devotion as fragile as a thread before a storm. His once ornate silk garments had been replaced by soft gowns, and his sumptuous bedding was soaked through to cushion his skin. The gilded bedstead now groaned beneath the weight of a festering body, bearing the burden of an entire kingdom. Each time he shifted, the linens creaked an unspoken lament, echoing through the chamber. At night, when the grand hall's lights were extinguished and silence enveloped the palace, only Henry's faint moans remained. The crackling of his decaying flesh sounded like the fractures of a collapsing dynasty, and the rustle of his bed curtains in the cold draught became a haunting symphony. Occasionally, the snap of torn bandages or the stifled gasp of an attendant punctuated the darkness, confirming that this was the final requiem of a once indomitable king. By the dim glow of dwindling candles, the bandages were changed again and again, each reveal a display of dark crimson and sickly green exudate, a mingling of burned flesh and tarry blood. The fragrant water proved useless. It only coaxed more discharge from the sores. The putrid fluid soaked the cloths and dripped onto the cold stone floor. The odour lingered for hours, permeating every corner, rendering any attempt at masking it with herbs futile. Attendants would hold their scented bowls beneath their noses, hands shaking as they replaced bandages, eyes darting toward the door as if hoping the outside chill might cleanse the horrors within. Every bead of sweat that fell on the stone floor told the tragedy of the realm. From lavish feasts to midnight ulcerations, from power's delights to the king's humiliating decay, thick quilts and plush pillows could not muffle Henry's agonized cries that resounded through every alcove of the palace. Those sounds etched themselves into the minds of all who heard them, a reminder that authority offered no refuge from the body's inevitable decline. The severity of his pain twisted him into a wreck, tears mingling with blood streaming down his hollow cheeks. Each effort to remain still to avoid tearing the bandages became a battle against a mattress soaked in his own fluids. As if the king were fighting an invisible foe, daytime brought no relief. Pale sunlight filtering through velvet-draped slits only intensified the stifling air. Birdsong from the enchanted gardens beyond could not penetrate the sick room's quarantine. Henry opened his eyes dully, staring at the small window pane, unable even to discern day from night. Attendants whispered, "Your Majesty," at the faintest stir, hastily offering his medicine, then hurried to spoon lukewarm gruel into his mouth. The gruel, cold and unpalatable, remained the only nourishment he could swallow. The stench of rot had embedded itself in everything: walls, curtains, clothing, even the surfaces of medicine jars. Occasionally, someone would hold a bundle of dried branches to the flame, hoping that the rising smoke would mask the reek, only to create a grotesque blend of incense and rotting flesh. Every surge of fragrance seemed to awaken the sores, causing them to weep even more copiously, as though seeking revenge. One night, a maidservant broke down in tears while attempting to change the king's bandages. Her hands trembled and lost their strength. She could not absorb both her tears and the discharges. A single teardrop fell onto the velvet wall, disappearing in her panic. She knelt, murmuring prayers, then bolted for the corridor, leaving behind an oppressive silence. The sound of her fleeing footsteps confirmed that none could endure the ordeal for long. Henry's agony extended hour by hour, minute by minute. He tried to gaze at the gilded ceiling, as if seeking the lost radiance of his former glory, but all he saw were flaking patches of paint and the dim glow of a dying flame. Every vestige of his past heroism had dissolved into the vast ocean of present suffering. Gradually, the ulcers ceased being mere wounds and became witnesses to his crimes: brutality, greed, and boundless desire. Strips of torn skin on the pillow served as the final pieces of his guilt-ridden story, shattering any remaining veneer of royalty. Amid the endless dressing changes and futile treatments, the ritual of decay continued as a never-ending tragedy. Every sound in that sick chamber: moans, ripping linen, the splash of fluids united in an unsettling melody, the requiem of worldly power, the sacred chant of an empire unravelling when all traditional remedies had failed. The Tudor court physicians were forced to resort to scalpels and searing irons. Daily they incised the ulcers to drain away the pus, and the horrifying sight of flesh being lanced made the king's screams echo through the corridors. At such times, even the guards would raise signs reading "No gathering" to keep curious onlookers at bay. Folk cures onions, honey, boiled figs were tried one after another, but each only inflamed the wounds further, turning them a deeper, angry red. As desperation set in, they concocted a mixture of pulverized human skull, rose oil, and opium, pressing the macabre paste onto the sores before administering doses of mercury, now known to be a potent neurotoxin, in hopes of purifying his blood. There were occasions when the king was made to drink what they called a cleansing wine, spiked with substances so fearsome that even his most loyal attendants recoiled. The acrid tang of burnt flesh mingled with the metallic sting of mercury, suffocating the chamber in a pall of dread. The pressure on the medical staff extended beyond mere expertise. Failure meant treason, and treason could cost them their heads. Dr. William Butts was reported to have wept when ordered once more to lance the king's agonized limbs. Thomas Wendy recorded in guarded language the horrendous burden of tending what amounted to a living corpse. One physician even suggested applying vinegar mixed with animal dung to cleanse the blood, a practice so foul that it only aggravated the ulcers and provoked Henry's wrath when he roused from an opium stupor. Through the long, oppressive afternoons, clouds of rosemary and frankincense smoke filled the air in a desperate bid to mask the smell of decay. Yet more dreadful than the stench was the terror that gripped every healer. They could neither flee nor refuse. For a single disgruntled glance from the king, could spell immediate execution. Each lancet's cut, each drop of tincture, carved another tragic stroke in the final portrait of the Lion of England, once triumphant, now fallen beneath unchecked power and indulgence. In their darkest hour, the physicians turned to ever more exotic remedies. They applied sheets soaked in a mixture of boiled figs and honey, long used as a poultice to draw out poison, only to find that the mixture accelerated the spread of gangrene. At times, Henry was administered draughts of distilled flowers, a syrup rumoured to ease pain but little more than a sweet poison. His attendants described the king's face contorting with renewed agony as he swallowed, and then slumping back onto his pillows, breath-ragged, his eyes glistening with tears of frustration. One afternoon, in a grim ritual witnessed by only a handful of the most devoted aides, Dr. Butts held a pair of red-hot irons over the worst of the king's lesions, searing away necrotic tissue in the name of healing. Henry's anguished roar reverberated off the stone walls, drowning out the even more dreadful sound of flesh sizzling on metal. The flames cast grotesque shadows across the chamber, turning it into a macabre theatre where science and superstition both took the stage. Despite the horror of these procedures, the court's hierarchy brooked no delay. Lords and bishops pressed for news of Henry's recovery. Each report of progress raised hopes that were dashed the moment the swelling returned and the weeping wounds opened anew. Royal edicts demanding loyalty were issued under the king's seal, even as all who penned them knew the bearer of that seal lay dying of his own excesses. By candlelit midnight, the chamber seemed to have shrunk into the king's body itself. Attendants whispered prayers under their breaths, their faces pale reflections of the tormented monarch. None could meet Henry's gaze. When they dared, they saw not a mighty sovereign, but a man broken by his own appetites. For each moment of fleeting hope, when a poultice appeared to soothe, or a tincture offered respite, there came a terrible relapse. Fresh blisters, deeper discoloration, fetid fluid, pooling like liquid rot. In whispering tones, the staff spoke of a curse, some ancient malady reawakened. Others blamed the very hands meant to heal, transforming scalpel and cautery into instruments of torture. The line between treatment and torment blurred, until it vanished entirely. The tapestry of Henry's reign, once woven with conquest, devotion, and splendour, now lay ragged, stained with the gore and sorrow of his final days. And so each morning the physicians returned, renewed both in fear and resolve, to repeat the ghastly ceremonies, to peel back bandages, to rasp away blackened tissue, to coax yet another drop of life from a body desperate to surrender. Ach, Doctor, achingly aware of his own mortality, studied the king's agony as though it were a text revealing the limits of human endurance. Yet no parchment could contain the true gravity of their failure. As Henry's life hovered between flickering hope and certain doom, the Tudor court outside maintained its rigid pageantry. Candles burned in the chapels, ambassadors exchanged curt pleasantries, and the machinery of governance purred on, sustained by the illusion that the king's health would somehow be restored. But within those sealed doors, the final act played out, an unrelenting dirge of knife, flame, and mercurial draughts, each intended to save the monarch, but each driving him inexorably toward his ultimate fate. When the physicians at last stepped back, their instruments stained, and their spirits broken, they left behind a scene of devastation. Henry's body lay ravaged, his chest rising and falling in shallow gasps, his eyes dull with resignation. The hallmarks of his reign power, piety, and pride had been stripped away, revealing a raw and merciless truth, that no remedy, however extreme, could halt the ravages of a body ravaged from within. In those final hours, the Lion of England was reduced to the frail silhouette of a man, undone by the very forces he had once commanded without mercy. In the grip of utter desperation, The king's mind began to fracture. At first, it was small lapses, garbled speech, forgetting the names of his closest attendants, mistaking one chamber for another. But soon the hallucinations surged with terrifying clarity. Henry proclaimed that shadowy figures lurked in the corners of his bedchamber. And on more than one occasion, he fell to his knees before unseen entities. On one night, he shrieked, "Begone, you with the black eyes," and tried to crawl across the bed, dragging his festering legs in agony, an episode so horrifying that even veteran courtiers recoiled in shock. Traditional faith offered him no refuge. The emperor, who had torn authority from the pope, now begged for a priest's blessing. At times he demanded the sprays of holy water be removed, accusing the Catholic rites of invading his pain. Once, a maid surreptitiously placed a protective charm beneath his pillow and then vanished without a trace. Rumours swept the palace that the king was cursed by Anne Boleyn's restless spirit or by the shade of Cardinal Thomas More. Some whispered openly that he was possessed by demonic forces. The servants who attended him lived in constant terror. A single misstep, a fleeting glance, could be construed as treasonous. On more than one occasion, the king ordered his physicians to taste their own concoctions before he would swallow them. One such doctor complied only to vomit at the first sip. Henry, in the thick of opium's haze, laughed a grim, mocking laugh and drank the brew regardless. The Hippocratic oath and fear of royal wrath bound his healers in a cruel dilemma. To fail in treatment meant execution, but to refuse meant the same fate. Gradually, the physical torment morphed into psychological torture. There were days when Henry fell silent for hours, then erupted into low, sinister laughter, as though delighting in his own ruin. The wind that howled through the palace corridors seemed to harmonize with his moans, transforming Whitehall into an open-air gallery of madness, a shameful monument to the unravelling of a once omnipotent monarch. In these moments, every murmur of prayer felt like a betrayal, every whispered chant an intrusion upon his suffering. On nights when the candles flickered low, Henry would clutch at the sheets, pressing his face into the cold linen as if it might guarantee some measure of safety. When he glanced up, his eyes were haunted by terror rather than regal defiance. His bedchamber, once a bastion of power, had become a carnival of phantoms, real or imagined, each reflecting a fragment of the king's shattered psyche. The tension within the Royal Medical Corps reached a fever pitch. Dr. William Butts, who had once shed tears over the scalpel's cut, now accepted that he stood powerless before the king's mind. Even Thomas Wendy's secret diary entries shifted from clinical observations to anguished reflections on the horror of serving a man who both demanded and feared every remedy. No longer simply physicians, they had become reluctant jailers in a cell of flesh and delusion, bound by oaths they could neither fulfill nor escape. Despite all the rituals of care, the incantations, the ointments, the prayers, the king's breakdown only deepened. At times, he would suddenly call for the imperial standard, demanding to be dressed in his ceremonial robes. On others, he would angrily command that every symbol of sovereignty be removed, insisting that such pomp threatened to suffocate him. His contradictions echoed through the silent nights, leaving attendants to tiptoe between hope and dread, praying that the next dawn would bring either mercy or release. By the final days, Henry's condition had transcended mere illness. It was an exhibition of the human mind's fragility under the weight of unchecked power and unbridled ambition. The Lion of England, who had once roared commands across battlefields and courts alike, now whimpered in his bed, tormented by ghosts of his own making. Whitehall Palace stood witness to his descent, its stone corridors forever echoing the hollow thuds of his agony, a reminder that not even the greatest monarch is immune to the ravages of his own body and mind. The king's bedchamber had transformed into a realm of unrelenting gloom, known among the household simply as the dark chamber. The once opulent carpets were ripped up or draped in heavy black curtains, and the walls were concealed beneath sombre velvet hangings. Light seeped only from dozens of candles scattered on shelves, beside the bed, and even on the floor, casting flickering halos of flame that resembled a perpetual funeral vigil. There was no music, no laughter, only a silence, so profound it felt alive, suffocating any whisper of comfort or hope. In the dark chamber, an unspoken rule forbade any raised voice. Attendants moved like shadows, their footsteps barely more than a breath on the stone floors. For a single glance of ire from the king could seal a fate worse than the decay itself. One maid swore she beheld a chilling figure standing at the foot of the bed, indistinct in form, but radiating cold that seeped into her bones, and she descended into madness not long after. It was said that Henry sometimes murmured to the ceiling as though forging a dialogue with otherworldly forces, only to break into inconsolable sobs, for reasons no one dared ask. The stench of rotting flesh exuding from his festering ulcers had permeated every surface. The walls, the curtains, the very air itself. Sprigs of rosemary, incense, and dried herbs were burned ceaselessly in a futile attempt to mask the odour, but to no avail. The dark chamber had become a living tomb, where death and decay coexisted in grim harmony. Whenever a newcomer dared step inside, the king's sunken eyes would track them, as if to challenge, "Do you dare betray me?" A question that hung heavy in the musty candlelight. Outside that black-draped sanctuary, only the soft shuffle of footsteps and hushed prayers drifted along the corridors, occasionally mingling with the distant howl of a palace hound trapped behind shuttered windows. The Grand Palace had ceased to be the epicenter of power. It had become a monument to fear and dissolution. Ambassadors and courtiers no longer ventured close, whispering that the very stones of Whitehall had absorbed the terror emanating from the dark chamber. Within that oppressive stillness, the king's attendants fashioned an improvised routine of ritual and dread. Each morning before dawn, a select few would slip into the chamber on tiptoe to bathe Henry's wounds in cool water, speaking only in whispers so soft they risked being swallowed by the darkness. They would change his bandages with hands trembling from both fear and exhaustion, praying silently that the new dressings might staunch the tide of infection. By candlelight, they stood vigil through the waning nights, listening to the crescendo of the king's groans, as though it were the herald of an impending storm. Despite the elaborate precautions, the living quarters adjacent to the dark chamber felt the decay bleeding outward. Black curtains had been drawn across every doorway to contain the stench, but occasionally a rogue breeze slipped through, carrying the odour of rot into once hallowed halls. In the private chapel beyond, a solitary candle burned before a tattered altar, as if the very walls there sought to distance themselves from the regal necropolis next door. The isolation inflicted on the king was total. He lay swathed in layer upon layer of hastily laundered linens, each stained with the evidence of his disintegration. No visitor, however high-born, fully traversed the threshold unless summoned by a trembling herald. Even then, they spoke their petitions in low tones, not daring to look upon the gaunt monarch, whose breath came hard and whose eyes flickered like dying embers. And when they did meet his hollow gaze, they found not a sovereign, but a spectre, a man stripped bare by his own unrelenting hunger for power and pleasure. In time, rumours of the Dark Chamber's horrors spread beyond the palace gates. Common folk told of a mad king entombed alive, a ruler whose body no longer heeded his commands. Bards composed hushed ballads of the sovereign's fall from grace, ending each refrain with a lament for the once mighty Henry I. Yet even such tales carried a note of caution. None could truly fathom the terror that simmered within Whitehall's blackened heart. And so the days bled into nights, each one identical to the last, a ceaseless vigil of shadows and flame, of rotting flesh and whispered prayers, contained within walls that bore witness to a monarchy's final unravelling. The Dark Chamber stood as the ultimate testament to the fragility of human ambition, a place where even a king's grandeur could be consumed by the relentless advance of decay. On the coldest morning of the year, Henry suffered a violent convulsion. The bed shook as though rocked by an earthquake, and the candle perched on the bedside table flickered wildly before toppling over. A terrified attendant cried out for help as the royal physicians rushed in, but they could not stop his body from thrashing, curling into itself, eyes rolling wildly, mouth frothing. One courtier who witnessed the scene later described the sound as akin to a wild beast's roar. The seizure ended as abruptly as it had begun, leaving the king in a state of half-consciousness and half-delirium. His right side lay paralyzed. His face drooped into a grotesque mask, and his speech tumbled out in endless, meaningless repetition. The common folk called it a stroke. Modern medicine concurs that was likely the case. He could no longer issue decrees, no longer condemn traitors, or bestow blessings. His once thunderous voice was gone. That very night, attendants were summoned in haste to prepare for Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was to deliver the king's final prayers. Cranmer knelt beside Henry's bill, murmuring liturgies in a low voice, beseeching some sign from the king's fading spirit. After several long minutes, Henry squeezed the Archbishop's hand with a faint grip, barely more than a whisper of movement. It was the last gesture he would ever make, a silent farewell, barely noticed in the tense hush. No cannon boomed in salute, no banners snapped in the wind. There was only an absolute, horrifying silence that fell over Whitehall Palace. The stone corridors seemed to hold their breath, as though waiting for some grand announcement that never came. At last, a lone sentinel dared to murmur, "The king is dead," and the words broke the silence like thunder, sending ripples of disbelief and grief through the stillness. Henry I had reigned for over 3 decades, but his passage from life was not marked by grandeur or spectacle. Instead, it concluded with a brief exhale, and those faint, final convulsions that still echoed in the minds of all who heard them. There was no grand farewell, no final proclamation of his glory, only the sobering truth that even the mightiest sovereign can slip away in the fragile space between breath and silence. In the days that followed, the dark chamber was sealed, curtains were drawn, and a small group of officials sealed Henry's remains in a hastily prepared coffin. Word of his death was kept discreet for 3 days to allow the Privy Council to secure the succession and prevent unrest. Meanwhile, the cold wind of January blew through the empty halls, carrying with it the lingering echo of the king's last gasp. Public mourning was orchestrated with meticulous care. The funeral procession from Whitehall to Windsor was subdued, almost ghostly. Nobles strode in solemn silence. Clergy chanted dirges in low tones, and even the horses seemed hesitant to draw the king's coffin. At every stop, prayers were offered, but none could mask the sorrow or the faint, pervasive odour that followed the bier, as though death itself had accompanied the cortege. When Henry's body was finally interred at St. George's Chapel, the tomb was a stark affair, a simple stone slab unadorned by effigies or inscriptions. Plans for a grand monument were abandoned. The funds too depleted, the court too haunted. Thus, the man who had reshaped England's faith and waged wars across the continent was laid to rest in austere anonymity. His legacy preserved more in whispered cautionary tales than in marble or gold. And so the chapter closed on Henry I, he who had stormed the papal gates, dissolved monasteries, and redefined the very nature of kingship, departed this world in a breathless whisper. The roar of his younger days, the grandeur of his courtly pageants, and the thunder of his voice in council chambers were all reduced to memories flickering like dying embers. In that final, quiet moment, the great Lion of England yielded to the inescapable hush of mortality. Power would not permit the king's death to be announced immediately. For 3 days, the throne remained vacant, while Henry I's corpse lay undisturbed in the dark chamber, his body grotesquely bloated, and the stench of decay intensifying with each passing hour. Physicians and attendants soaked linen cloths in vinegar and bundles of dried herbs to mask the odour. But their efforts offered only fleeting relief. Pus from the festering sores seeped through the layers of cloth and onto the cold stone floor, where it pooled in dark. Sticky along the corridors of Whitehall, the ritual of court continued as though the king still lived. Servants brought trays of food, announcing that His Majesty was resting and recuperating. The Chancellery stamped royal documents and the Privy Council issued routine orders under his seal, their hollow formality preserving the illusion that death had not yet claimed its sovereign. In the palace's hushed interlude, a silent power struggle erupted. Protestant reformers sought to expedite the accession of Prince Edward, conservative Catholics rallied behind Princess Mary, and foreign lords watched for an opportunity to intervene. When the time came to move the king's remains, the full horror of decomposition revealed itself. His abdomen had swollen to an unnatural girth, and his skin had turned a sickly greenish blue. The mercury and poultices applied in his final days had further leached the life from his features, rendering his face ghostly and hollow, as pallbearers laid him in a hastily constructed wooden coffin. A sudden, terrifying crack echoed through the chamber. The coffin lid, pushed from within by expanding gases, burst open. Festering fluids surged forth, spilling across the floor in a dark, greasy tide. A stray dog, drawn by the fetid odour, trotted in and began to lap at the discharge before aghast attendants chased it away. Word of the scene spread like wildfire through London. Courtiers whispered in taverns of a monarch whose body literally erupted from within. To some, this grotesque spectacle was divine justice incarnate. The brazen king has finally received his reckoning, they proclaimed. Others among the nobility recoiled in horror, refusing to come near the tainted coffin, while a few acted swiftly to arrange the funeral rites, hoping that a prompt burial might dispel the malign presence that seemed to cling to the palace. Those 3 days of secrecy, intended to safeguard the succession, instead became a period of dread that London would never forget. Commoners spoke of the dark chamber as though it were a forbidden crypt, its very doors a barrier between the living and a horror beyond imagining. Even after the coffin was finally sealed, rumours persisted that black smoke drifted from the palace slits, and that the stench of corruption lingered in the tapestries. On the 4th day, the Privy Council convened in solemn session to proclaim Edward as the new king. A muted trumpet called the announcement, but it felt more like a lament than a fanfare. Courtiers muffled their voices as they pledged oaths to the child monarch, their eyes still haunted by the memory of the decaying corpse that had occupied the throne. Princess Mary, shrouded in black silk, took her place at the side of the council table, her expression inscrutable to her loyalists. Her silent grief was a quiet triumph. To her adversaries, it was a warning of unresolved tensions that would soon erupt. As the funeral cortege wound its way from Whitehall to Windsor, the pallbearers bore the sealed coffin beneath a canopy of black cloth. The procession was solemn and hushed. Soldiers marched in rigid formation, their halberds glinting in the pale winter light. Clergy chanted dirges in low, reverent tones, and the streets were lined with townspeople who bowed their heads, many clutching rosaries or crosses. The air was cold, but no fire was lit to ward off the chilling breeze, as though even the elements recoiled from drawing too near the king's final passage. At every rest stop, mourners offered prayers, tossing handfuls of frankincense onto braziers, an attempt to purify the air and lay the king's spirit to rest. Yet the incense mingled with the distant echo of the coffin's bursting and the memory of that dog's intrusion, creating an eerie undercurrent that tugged at the procession's dignity. Some soldiers quickened their pace, as though eager to distance themselves from the tainted cargo, while others simply stared straight ahead, their faces rigid with suppressed revulsion. When the cortege finally arrived at St. Croup's, George's chapel, the hastily constructed tomb awaited, or rather, merely a cavity in the floor. Unadorned and provisional, the coffin was lowered amidst a final flourish of ecclesiastical ceremony. The Archbishop of Canterbury intoned prayers for the king's soul, and a handful of nobles placed wreaths of white lilies atop the bier. No grand monument followed. There were no marble effigies, no gilded inscriptions proclaiming his virtues. Instead, the sealed tomb was covered with a plain slab of grey stone. For its emptiness, a testament to both the haste of his interment and the impoverished state of his legacy. In the days that followed, the events took on the character of legend. Pamphlets circulated, decrying the cruelty of concealing Henry's death and praising God for the purging of a tyrant's corruption. Others, more sympathetic, composed elegies on the fallen king, lamenting the fate of a ruler who had once wielded Europe's most formidable throne. Yet beneath both voices lay the same chilling awareness that power, no matter how absolute, cannot forestall the decay of flesh and the reckoning of mortality. Thus ended the 3-day siege of secrecy, a harrowing interlude in which the palace itself became a carnival of fear, and the personal agony of one man resonated as a crisis for an entire kingdom. The memory of those days would endure in the annals of history, not as a triumphant testament to royal decorum, but as a cautionary tale of how even a king's corpse can unleash chaos when power is wielded without restraint. The funeral of Henry I was a hurried affair at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. His coffin was interred in an unfinished vault, originally intended for Cardinal Wolsey, the once mighty ecclesiastic whom the king himself had deposed. The half-formed effigy that was meant to adorn the tomb was never carved. Instead, a simple slab of unpolished stone marked the resting place, devoid of any laudatory inscription or regal embellishment. In the days that followed, diplomats and courtiers alike set about polishing the narrative of the late king's passing. Official chronicles recorded that he laid down his life in peaceful piety, and court painters produced serene portraits showing Henry reclining as if in slumber, haloed by divine light, entirely free of pain or decay. Tales of the coffin's explosive rupture or of a stray dog licking the king's festering remains were suppressed with the utmost secrecy, relegated to whispered rumour among tavern-goers and servants rather than the gilded pages of history. The final painted likenesses of Henry I found their place among the throne room's grand tapestries and the antechamber's ceremonial banners, serving as testament to the miraculous end of a monarch. These images portrayed his features as unblemished, his posture regal, his countenance serene, an illusion of timeless authority preserved in oil and canvas. Yet behind this veneer of triumph and sanctity, the Tudor realm was mired in turmoil. The royal coffers lay empty. The newly established Church of England teetered on the brink of schism, and the economy staggered under the weight of war, debts, and inflation. King Edward VI, Henry's sickly young son, ascended the throne under the guidance of powerful regents. Meanwhile, Princess Mary, Henry's daughter and defender of Catholic orthodoxy, prepared to challenge Protestant reforms once empowered, and Princess Elizabeth, the future Virgin Queen, watched from the sidelines. Her position precarious, the court fractured along doctrinal lines, each faction claiming the late king's legacy as justification for its own agenda. In the shadows of the palace, whisper networks and spy rings proliferated, each seeking to shape the nascent reign in its preferred image. In this fractious atmosphere, Henry's true legacy remained the stark and bloody reminder of absolute power's dangers. The stain of his death, the purulent decay, the macabre rupturing of his coffin. The howling dog lingered in the popular imagination as a cautionary tale. It spoke not of glory or conquest, but of the fragility of flesh and the inevitability of decline. Even for those who once wielded godlike authority, scholars and moralists of the following generation would point to Henry's final days as evidence that tyranny and unchecked ambition bear their own price. Sermons in parish churches warned that even a king cannot escape the rot of his own body. And plays at London's theatres sometimes featured allusions to a sovereign undone by his appetites. Henry's sumptuous palaces, his lavish feasts, his ruthless suppression of dissent, all were cast in a new light as preludes to his grotesque demise. Yet for all the moralizing, the story of Henry I's rotting death retained a primal power. It became a fixture of English folklore, a narrative recited in hushed tones to caution rising nobles and courtiers against overreach. The image of the once mighty king reduced to a putrefying carcass in the dark chamber of Whitehall served as a visceral counterpoint to the polished statuary and golden effigies that adorned his monuments. By the end of the 16th century, artists and historians alike had woven the majestic death myth into the Tudor centennial celebrations. But popular ballads continued to speak of the dark chamber and the king who lingered in decay. In a culture that prized lineage and legacy, the tale of Henry's end underscored an uncomfortable truth, that the grandeur of a reign is but a fleeting veneer, and that power without moderation invites catastrophic collapse. Ultimately, the final inheritance of Henry I was not the splendours of his court or the church he forged, but the lesson that absolute authority courts absolute ruin. His rotting death became a bloody, enduring parable of impermanence, a reminder that no crown, however heavy, can long outlast the mortal frame. It adorns, in that dark and musty vault at Windsor, beneath an unadorned stone, lay not just a fallen monarch, but the echo of a warning, that unchecked ambition, like flesh itself, must one day yield to the inexorable advance of decay. After the burial, the Tudor court moved swiftly to conceal every gruesome detail of Henry's demise. Official chronicles uniformly declared that the late king found his rest in peaceful virtue, omitting any mention of the coffin's explosive rupture or the stray dog that scavenged at his remains. Court historians and artists were commissioned to recast the scene. In their renderings, Henry lay serenely with his eyes closed, haloed by divine light, one hand resting gently upon a gilded Bible, with a diminutive angel by his side. This artifice became known as the majestic death, an epic historical myth tailored for political expediency. Such luminous paintings and flowery court annals easily seduced future generations into forgetting the king's bodily torment. Beneath a white marble bust, an inscription proclaimed, "He departed in tranquil grace." Effectively draping black velvet in the palace's once morbid chamber, courtiers still whispered that none dared record the truth. For any deviation from the official line risked severe repercussions. In effect, writing the unvarnished facts of Henry's end was tantamount to courting disgrace or worse. The illusion of an immortal monarch persisted. Every year, Westminster Hall hosted solemn memorials to honour a sovereign depicted as wise, powerful, and benevolent. Incense curled toward vaulted ceilings as full congregations recited prayers for the king's soul. Meanwhile, tales of the rotting corpse and putrid streams that once coursed through Whitehall's walls were relegated to tavern gossip and market square whispers, perpetuating them as little more than macabre folklore rather than factual history. Yet the sorrowful truth of Henry's end was not unearthed to malign his dynasty, but to serve as a stark moral lesson. However swiftly one may condemn wrongdoing or mete out punishment to rivals, every human body remains subject to decay. The palace itself became a museum of deception, a place where the truth was buried with the king's corpse to uphold the mythos of unassailable power. In the hush of candlelit corridors, a subtle rebellion of memory persisted. Some old servants, too fearful to speak publicly, shared their recollections of the dark chamber in hushed tones by hearth fires. They spoke of the acrid stench that once pervaded the halls and the nightmarish symphony of moans, asserting that the official narrative was a gilded lie. But their voices were fragile, easily drowned by the orchestrated grandeur of court ceremonies. Meanwhile, Foreign ambassadors who quizzed courtiers about the nature of Henry's passing received only the polished account. They were shown luminous portraits, read lofty eulogies, and attended rehearsed orations celebrating a king who passed from this world in holy peace. None of these envoys could have imagined the magnitude of the cover-up, or the way that political necessity had conscripted art and scholarship into the service of a carefully constructed legacy. For a time, the Tudor court thrived under this splendid pretense. Successive monarchs leaned on the legend of the majestic death to bolster their own claims to divine favour. When Edward VI summoned Parliament, he cited his father's righteous departure as evidence that God had anointed their house. Mary I, in her brief restoration of Catholic rights, referenced Henry's pious passing to justify her turn back to Rome, and Elizabeth I would later employ the memory of an unbroken king to unite her subjects in Protestant resolve. Yet beneath this veneer, the kingdom wrestled with the aftershocks of Henry's reign and of his demise. The royal treasury remained depleted, the church divided, and the common people strained under new taxes to pay down wartime debts. Writers in the margins of private letters and clandestine journals pointed to the grotesque end of their erstwhile sovereign as a metaphor for the fragility of earthly glory. They noted that while the tomb was ornate and the epitaph grandiose, no sumptuous monument could truly atone for the rot lurking beneath its surface. By the 18th century, the majestic death had cemented itself in textbooks and chapels, while occasional antiquarians would stumble upon faded scraps of eyewitness testimony fragments detailing the coffin's grisly burst or the dog's nocturnal feast. These scraps, however, were filed away in dusty vaults, their significance overshadowed by dogmatic histories that preferred the spectacle of holy serenity over the horror of physical decay. Thus, the palace in which Henry I once wielded absolute authority transformed into an edifice of willful amnesia. Its walls, tapestries, and marble statuary served as silent conspirators in a grand illusion, preserving a myth of regal sanctity at the expense of human truth. And in that grand tableau of power, the unspoken message remained clear. To challenge the crafted narrative of a king's honourable rest was to undermine the very foundations of the monarchy itself. In the end, Henry's most unsettling legacy was not the church he severed from Rome or the wars he waged, but the lesson woven into the hush of Whitehall's corridors. That power demands the sacrifice not only of rivals and principles, but also of honesty and memory. For the Tudors, as for any dynasty, the darkest secret of all is that the throne must shine. Even if the flesh that once occupied it must rot in anonymity, buried beneath a slab of unmarked stone, and entombed within a palace that remembered only its own grandeur. When Henry I's body lay finally at rest in the vault at Windsor, the machinery of Tudor power immediately shifted into wartime mode behind closed doors. His 9-year-old son, Edward, was proclaimed King Edward VI. Yet the official records carefully omitted any mention of the 3 days during which the throne stood vacant. In those secret hours, the Privy Council moved swiftly to secure the realm. The royal treasury was sealed with new wax impressions. The Great Seal was locked away under guard, and trusted courtiers were posted at every entrance to ensure no unauthorized hand could tamper with the instruments of government. 2 opposing factions, each waiting for an opening, prepared their maneuvers in hushed confidence. On one side stood the reformers, Protestant nobles and clerics who had championed Henry's break with Rome and now sought to accelerate Edward Seymour, the newly created Duke of Somerset, into the position of Lord Protector. Somerset, the king's late brother-in-law and a seasoned courtier, marshalled his allies under the banner of safeguarding the young king's reforms against Catholic reaction. Opposing them were the traditionalists, rallying to Princess Mary, Henry's eldest daughter by Catherine of Aragon. They planned to curb Protestant influence and restore elements of Rome's authority, arguing that Mary's proximity to the bloodline entitled her to significant sway over the boy king. In the months that followed Edward's accession, Westminster and Whitehall presented a tranquil front to the outside world. Foreign ambassadors were received with all the customary ceremony, granted audiences in ornate reception rooms, where courtiers bowed and quailed before the empty throne draped in black velvet. Yet within the palace's labyrinthine corridors, a far different drama played out. Secret orders, stamped with the late king's seal, circulated among the royal secretaries and clerks, maintained the utmost silence regarding the late monarch's passing and the nature of his interment. Whispers of his decaying corpse, or worse, of the coffin's rupture and a scavenging dog, were deemed high treason, punishable by death. This climate of cloistered anxiety plunged England into a bizarre limbo, a realm of no king yet a king nonetheless. Government business proceeded in the name of Henry VIII. Documents commanding, by the King's Majesty's will, still flowed from the court's chancery, despite the fact that the bearer of that will lay in a lead-lined coffin under Windsor's chapel floor. Ministers continued to sign proclamations and treaties with the seal they had known for decades, as though the king's flesh remained animated by royal prerogative, even in death. In later years, chroniclers would look back on this interregnum with a singular epithet: the 3 dark days. It was a time when the authority of the crown flickered between worlds, its heartbeat audible in the scratch of quills and the creak of the Privy Council's chairs, yet absent from any living chest. The young Edward, too frail to rule, was thrust into a position where every pronouncement carried the weight of his father's legacy and the spectre of that sealed coffin to the populace. The news of Henry's death was a subdued shock. Street criers announced the child, King's accession with muted fanfare, urging calm and loyalty. Shops remained open, churches held brief services, and markets bustled on an outward normalcy that belied the undercurrents of fear. Rumours of plots circulated as freely as coins, each whisper of 3 days of darkness, kindling new stories of the late king's final agonies. Meanwhile, Somerset and his fellow protectorate councillors moved decisively to fortify Edward's position. Key fortresses and armouries were placed under the watch of Somerset's personal retainers. Local sheriffs received discreet instructions to suppress any talk of Mary's claim, and envoys were dispatched to European courts to reassure foreign powers that England's succession remained unshaken. Yet for every measure of consolidation, Mary's supporters countered with their own intelligence network, feeding reports of Catholic sympathy and promising that under Mary's steady hand, England would return to the faith of her mother. By the time the 3 days of secrecy ended and the public proclamation of Edward's rule was formally issued, the balance of power had already tilted irrevocably towards Somerset's faction. The seal of Henry VIII, once a symbol of absolute sovereignty, had become little more than a prop in a grand political theatre. The boy king's actual ability to reign was subordinate to the regency's real politique, and Parliament, eager to maintain stability, quickly confirmed Edward's legislative agenda, one that veered sharply toward further Protestant reforms. Still, beneath the official decorum lay the embers of possible revolt. Mary's Catholic adherents, emboldened by clandestine mass gatherings and the support of powerful earls in the north, prepared themselves for a moment when their faction might strike. In the kitchens and taverns of provincial towns, artisans and peasants spoke in hushed tones of the king in the coffin and the boy in the palace, their words laced with both pity and defiance. Thus England moved forward under a veil of ceremony and shadow, the throne occupied by a child, but defined by the memory of a corpse. The skeleton key to this peculiar chapter was not buried in stone or sealed in lead, but lived in the whispers of courtiers and the scratch of pens, etching the 3 dark days into the history of a realm caught between the final gasp of one reign and the first breath of another. The Tudor treasury teetered on the brink of collapse. Henry I, left behind crippling war debts from campaigns in France and Scotland, the immense expense of refashioning the church, the lavish construction of palaces, and extravagant banquets that drained the coffers, In a desperate bid to prolong solvency, the crown resorted to debasing the currency minting coins, with reduced silver content triggering rampant inflation that left commoners impoverished. Bread prices soared, cloth became unaffordable, and social unrest simmered just beneath the surface, threatening to erupt into full-scale rebellion. The Church of England, Henry's signature legacy, soon unravelled into factional chaos. Having torn the nation from papal authority to secure his own marriage and annulments, Henry had hoped to establish a stable national church. Instead, the nascent institution rotted from within. When young King Edward VI ascended the throne, his regents enacted strenuous Protestant reforms, abolishing altars, mandating English-only services, and outlawing Catholic rituals. These measures enraged conservative Catholics, who saw their traditional beliefs under siege. Upon Edward's untimely death at the age of 16, Mary I. Henry's eldest daughter, by Catherine of Aragon, seized the throne with the promise of restoring papal supremacy. Mary's zeal for Catholic orthodoxy earned her the sobriquet Bloody Mary, as she ordered the execution of hundreds of Protestant dissenters. Her ardent reversals left England's religious landscape fractured and traumatized. Finally, Elizabeth Primera, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, inherited a kingdom exhausted by doctrinal whiplash. Elizabeth sought a via media, a middle way, by re-establishing the Church of England with ceremonial elements palatable to both Protestants and Catholics, forging a tenuous peace amid lingering distrust. 3 successive reigns bore the scars of Henry's final days. Edward's fragile health mirrored the fragility of the Reformed Church he championed, while Mary's brutal persecution reflected the embittered reaction to his violent suppression of Rome. Elizabeth's careful balancing act could not fully heal the wounds. The populace had endured too much upheaval, and the memory of the rotting king fostered a weary skepticism toward any sovereign's promises. Each sibling's tumultuous rule carried the burden of ignoble beginnings: a boy king shackled by regents, a queen steeped in vengeance, and a queen forced into compromise, all rooted in the traumatic legacy of Henry's decaying demise. By the close of Elizabeth's long and storied reign, the Tudor line had run its course. No direct male heir remained to claim the throne, and upon her death, the crown passed to the Stuarts through the Scottish branch of the family. England emerged from Tudor rule, rent by debt, riven by religious conflict, and haunted by a collective loss of faith in divine right. The royal treasury, once flush enough to fund continental wars, was drained and indebted to foreign bankers. Parish churches still echoed with bitter memories of burning heretics, and the common folk, who had once venerated the crown as a symbol of stability, now viewed it with wary pragmatism, aware that even a monarch's sanctity could not forestall the ultimate decay of both body and realm. Thus, the final chapter of the Tudor saga bore witness to a dynasty undone by its greatest triumphs. Henry's iron will had reshaped the nation and bent the church to his designs. But in death, his own body became the emblem of unchecked power's inevitable rot. The wars he waged left the treasury emptied, the church he forged fractured into opposing camps, and the feasts and palaces he commissioned fell into debt, laden disrepair. His 3 sovereign children, Edward the Reformer, Mary the Martyr, and Elizabeth the Peacemaker, all contended with the centrifugal forces unleashed by their father's ambitions, each struggling to steady a ship that had been mortally wounded by his final ruinous day. In the end, the Tudor dynasty's demise underscored a sobering truth, that absolute authority, when wielded without restraint, begets not eternal glory, but inherited chaos. The lessons of Henry I's rotting death echoed through the ages, a warning that opulence and sovereignty may dazzle the world, but they cannot avert the decay ordained by nature. England's passage from Tudor to Stuart was not merely a change of rulers, but the culmination of a century's worth of strain on body, spirit, and country strain that Henry's final, horrific end had set into motion. In countless history textbooks, Henry I is praised as a formidable monarch, pioneering reformer, and patron of the arts. Students are taught about his great reforms dissolving the monasteries to bolster the royal treasury, establishing new ecclesiastical structures, and supporting architects, poets, and musicians who defined the English Renaissance. Ornate illuminated manuscripts and oil paintings depict a radiant young king, a square-jawed face, eyes bright with resolve, clad in gilded armour, the very embodiment of authority and inviolable stature. Yet behind that resplendent facade lay a body racked by unimaginable suffering. By the end of his reign, Henry's once robust limbs had become gaunt and skeletal, and he was covered in ulcerations that oozed thick, black, foul-smelling discharge. Contemporary chronicles recorded the breath of death that lashed from his mouth a sickly sweet odour reminiscent of rotting fruit. On bitterly cold winter nights, his agonized moans rent the air throughout Whitehall's corridors, blending with the weak thumping of his heart and the crackle of burning candles, as if the king's decaying flesh resisted the very light that sought to illuminate it. From that horror emerged the legend of the majestic death. Court painters and propagandists reversed the narrative. Henry I was portrayed lying in tranquil repose, his eyes gently closed, a halo of light around his head, one hand resting lightly on a gilded Bible, a diminutive angel at his side. The majestic death became a political myth, proclaiming that even in death, the king retained his dignity and virtue. These two images, one of unparalleled sovereignty, the other of grotesque decay, coexisted for centuries. Students learned only the first image, the immortal king, the unblemished, youthful visage. Whispers of the dark chamber and the midnight moans remained the province of secret oral tradition. This stark contrast became prized material for the genre of historical lullabies, a style of storytelling that blends grandeur with haunting introspection to both captivate and enlighten. Through the tragic tale of Henry I's final days, the video not only reenacts a sorrowful chapter of history, but also offers viewers profound values and messages. First, the story reminds us of the fragility of the human body. No matter how great one's power may be, Henry once ruled an empire and determined his nation's fate. Yet in the end, he could not withstand the natural decay of the flesh. The stark contrast between the immortal king in painted portraits and the rotting corpse in the dark chamber illustrates an eternal truth. Physical strength is fleeting, whereas the cycle of birth, aging, sickness, and death is unchanging. This serves as a sobering warning to anyone who grows complacent in their authority or personal glory. Second, the video demonstrates the importance of honesty in recording history. When history is embellished or concealed, we risk overlooking invaluable lessons. The myth of the majestic death exists alongside the reality of the rotting king, only because the court sought to preserve its reputation. But this very concealment also obscured the massive consequences for finance, religion, and society. Only by confronting the truth, no matter how painful, can we hope to learn from it and avoid repeating past mistakes. Third, the power struggle that followed the king's death reveals the brutal nature of politics. The 3 days of enforced silence to arrange the succession were the prelude to a century of upheaval, collapse, and religious conflict. This reminds viewers that every decision about personnel or political strategy leaves an indelible mark on the course of history. That Edward VI ascended the throne as a child, that Mary I restored Catholicism through fire, and that Elizabeth I later forged a religious compromise, all stemmed from the power vacuum created in those final days of Henry's reign. Finally, the video encourages us to cherish the present and continuously reflect on our personal responsibilities. When faced with power or opportunity, remember that reputation is not eternal, and today's choices can leave a positive or negative legacy for generations to come. The image of blood-soaked bandages and oozing ulcers calls us to stand firmly for what is right. resisting the temptation to sacrifice ethics for fame or fortune. In conclusion, the video about Henry VIII's death is not merely a grisly slice of history, it is an epic cautionary tale about the limits of power, the necessity of historical truth, the harshness of politics, and each individual's duty to shape their own legacy. It compels viewers to live responsibly, honor the truth, and always remember, power can purchase glory, but it cannot purchase immortality.